I studied fiber as an undergrad at the University of Washington in Seattle. And when I got out of school, I thought, well, what am I going to do? You know, how am I going to earn a living? And I thought about going into textile design. So I traveled to Hendersonville, North Carolina, and studied with Beth Ann Knudsen at the Jacquard Center. And while I was there, I think for my second class I'd ever taken, I met a woman named Leah Cook, who was a professor of textiles at the California College of the Arts and Crafts. And she said, you know, you should study art, not design, and you should come study at CCAC with me. CCAC was one of the few schools in the country that had a TC1 loom, which was available to students to work on. So that was what kind of set me off on the path of working with this particular tool. What's really special about these looms is the ability to lift every thread on the loom individually. My particular loom has 880 threads on it, so each one of those threads can operate completely distinctly from every other thread on the loom. But you can purchase a loom that has several thousand threads on it, and so it allows the loom to act more like a drawing tool, or a tool that you could use more similarly to like an inkjet printer, for example. You could weave things that look photographic or hand-drawn, or designs that have kind of organic curving lines in them in a way that would be incredibly difficult and time-consuming on a floor loom. And so it's a really special device because it allows you the ability to translate anything into cloth. With a very bare minimum amount of instruction and access to Photoshop, one can put together a very simple file right off the bat. You know, I've been working with this technology for 13 years now. I guess I first was introduced to the Jacquard loom even 2 years before that, so 15 years. And I feel like I've kind of just like scratched the surface at this point. It's the tip of the iceberg. And I think that's part of the reason why I continue to work with it, is that it's constantly keeps me engaged. I'm constantly learning new things. I'm forever trying to figure out how to make things better, or how to fine-tune things. I can't imagine ever running out of areas of inquiry with this particular tool. But that being said, for people who have less maybe attention span or interest in it, you could very quickly also figure out how to put something together and still be able to weave it. You know, I think this particular loom is really wonderful. There's a couple hand-operated Jacquard looms which are available to kind of end-use consumers like myself. This one is a thread controller, so it doesn't have the tall harnessing up on top of the loom, and that makes it really so much easier to put it into a home studio space. I don't have to worry about having a ceiling clearance that's 2 stories tall. It becomes much easier if I ever have to move it, etc. But at the end of the day, it's also much more flexible in terms of it being an artist's tool than an industrial loom, because I don't have to worry about you know, my warp threads getting out of tension. It's much more manual, so I can really get in there and kind of manipulate things as I need to make things work for me. My loom has a width of about 29 inches wide, and so I'm actually weaving 2 pieces side by side next to each other, and I'm actually weaving them face down. And the reason for that is because I have like an extra weft that only comes up in certain areas, and so I have just a lot more flexibility, so I can put in the supplementary weft on the piece on the right-hand side independently of the one on the left-hand side because of how I've set up my file. If it were on an industrial loom, those wefts would always have to go all the way across. I wouldn't have the ability to sort of just lay them in certain areas as I'm going. So that would mean I would both be wasting more material, but also the cloth itself would be much bulkier. And at the same time, it wouldn't allow me to do that because things would be too kind of uneven. What's happening on the right side is not exactly what's happening on the left side. But because I'm only making pieces that are this small, that allows me the flexibility as well. I can just make something, you know, 20 inches tall and then cut it off the loom, cut those 2 pieces apart and kind of look at them, as opposed to having to weave, you know, a minimum of 5, 10, 15 yards before I can take it off the loom and then look at it and go, oh, that's not what I wanted. Okay. Back to the drawing board, and then I've wasted all that material in the meantime. But the bulk of my practice is really making one-of-a-kind art pieces that hang on the wall. And that could be anything from, you know, a small scale piece like this to some much larger pieces, which might be, you know, 10 feet wide or 30 feet tall, etc. So everything in between. And of course, I'm always limited by the width of my loom, but I can weave as long as I want, and I can always piece things together. So I'm very often kind of conceptualizing of a larger work and then kind of knocking it down into components and then making those one at a time and then figuring out how to kind of stitch them all together once it comes off of the loom. So this is a TC2 loom, and I've had it for 3 years now, since 2012. And it's so much more improved than the first version of the loom, the TC1, which I would have happily woven away on the TC1 my entire life if that was all that was available. But the TC2 weaves faster. I've only had one thread that's malfunctioned on me in the 3 years that I've had it, which is wonderful. So I just ignore that thread and it weaves like a dream. It also now is wireless, so I can just hook up my laptop to it. You know, it's just like the new improved version. I think they figured out what some of the shortcomings were on the first one and just made it better.